What is best in life? To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of your women.
Are you ready now to witness a power not seen for thousands of years? I am the strongest! I am the Viking!
Welcome to the Bulk Boys podcast, broadcasted live from my 525 square foot apartment with my fiance's stolen headphones. This week, I had the privilege of interviewing our Lord and Swampert, the large lad himself, Sam freaking Shethar. We cover his early history with combat sports, his transition from powerlifting into strongman, and the psycho lad's crush on his brother Max. Sam's YouTube channel is criminally underrated. You can find him on YouTube and Patreon at Shethar Training and direct coaching inquiries to shethartraining@gmail.com. The free program available on his Patreon took my bench from 300 to 315. His brother Max is on Instagram as at D1RepMax. Give them both a follow, dog man it.
I think I didn't hit record. God damn it. Okay. I hate to rewind it, but
you're good. You're good.
Okay. So we were just chatting for about 3 minutes just for the listeners, and I realized I didn't actually hit record, but hopefully that's the last snafu. So opening with a moment of silence for the co-host Jakob S, who's moving to New Mexico. That's right. Yep. Shouts out to Jacob. Hope he doesn't crash in the rainstorm. But yeah, today we got Sam on. I'm so stoked to have you, man. Been following your channel for quite a while. The large lad himself, the famous 600 bench, the 835.
Yep.
It's conventional deadlift.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And the sumo will be tested after the 880, I guess.
Yeah, got to do by once a year. Once a year sumo max out.
And you were saying that you don't really need to train it to kind of exceed your conventional numbers.
Yeah, as like a stronger legged lifter, generally speaking, guys with like very strong knee extensors, it doesn't take a whole lot. They intuitively understand how to get them into their pull. And I think my first, I want to say about 5-6 years training, I primarily pulled like a narrow stance sumo. So I do have like a lot of lifetime reps under my belt. So it doesn't take me a whole lot of practice. It would take me a lot of practice to be really proficient. And like, if I was powerlifting to like maximize my result, but because I'm built, like people say, oh, built for sumo, built for conventional. A lot of that just comes down to like hip strength, maybe a little bit of hip morphology, and then leg strength. People with strong legs tend to figure out sumo rather intuitively, whether they like cram their toes a little bit more forward, and it's a little bit more hinge heavy, they jam their toes way out. Maybe that comes down more to the hip morphology, but a lot of it just comes down to if you got strong legs, usually you'll sort yourself out sumo. So I don't need too much practice. So my kind of hope is I don't want to do it before the 880 conventional, just in case I hurt myself. But I think if I can do 880 conventional, I can probably do like a shitty training 900 sumo. Just I've always been able to get a little bit of weight out of it. So that's something that's like, okay, I'll be smart for once in my damn life and put that off till after I actually achieve the goal. But that is also something that's like maybe on the to-do list. Maybe it'd be a fun video. Just be like, what's up, boys? 0 prep. We're maxing out sumo. We'll see what I get.
Absolutely. Yeah. At what point do you think there was a point in your lifting career where you wouldn't have been the smart crow and just thrown in the sumo too early?
Yeah, I mean, I've always stuck to like this idea of like building my base, right? Like I definitely wasn't like the whole, oh, I feel good today, time to max out kind of like dumb, but I was a different kind of dumb where I'd be like, if let's say I'm training for like a big 8RM, because I think that's something that would be worthwhile. It'll get my legs bigger. So I'm squatting for this big 8RM. Instead of pacing things out until I can do that 8 to a very high quality, I would take it like 2-3 weeks ahead of when I should have. I would always try to do things before I was ready. I would like get fired up. I would have a bunch, like I would sniff some ammonia, have a bunch of caffeine, and I would like really grit out those things. And it's like, that's on paper awesome. You did it 2 weeks ahead of time, but it's like a quality 8RM matters more than like a balls to the wall did it early. Like it's supposed to be training. It's not supposed to be showing off the 8RM. So like, yeah, most of my training career, there's been like, I've got my own specific brand of being an idiot. Usually it isn't maxing out. Usually it's just going for stupid rep sets. But I'm not past that either. Definitely. That's still something that's very much in my repertoire.
Yeah. And so do you think I think that's a pretty common mistake for beginners and intermediates, myself included, is the testing and when they should be training.
Yeah, and that you can get into like a lot of nuance about that really, because like there's a great message there. And the nice part about the message is that it's relatively simple. If you just tell people testing, not training, testing, training, right? Like these are two different things. When in reality, there's a lot of things you can do in the gym that are both, right? Like a plus set, taking your final set for a rep out. That's a productive training stimulus. And it's also a way to check in where you're at. You're doing it after presumably your sub-maximal working sets. So it's not taking like away from the workout, but it also lets you kind of check in with that more all-out set at the end of each session. So there's things that kind of fall into the category of both testing and building. But the thing is that like I think people understand what we mean when we say don't always test. You should be building. Maybe we should be doing straight sets. I know it's more fun to always do the all-out top set and then back offs, but maybe sometimes there's some room to do some straight sub-maximal set building, right?
Yeah.
There's lots of like that's definitely one of those things that like I've tried to like communicate with my clients because they're like, well, what about testing versus building? And it's like even a single in training can be part of building yourself towards a heavier single, right? Like maybe a max effort single falls into that category of like very testing oriented, maybe less building oriented, unless you subscribe to more of like a conjugate style system where no, this day prescribes a max effort single. And that's the training effect we're looking for. In most modern powerlifting, the kind of periodization, that would be a sub-maximal single. And I'd say that's building and testing. That's part of training. You're like, back in the day, people are like, what are you doing all those singles for? Well, practicing my sport is that's what I'm doing them for, right? So it's like that whole thing gets a little muddy. So you don't get to have this nice cut. I wish we could have like all these nice cut and dries. Is this building or is it testing?
Yeah.
Again, we have to kind of use our noggin a little bit and say like, what percentage building, what percentage testing? And am I just kind of caving to that caveman itch of I want to try to do something cool versus is this actually a productive training session? And ideally, we balance those both so that the athlete's training motivation stays high and they don't just burn the fuck out on training when it's nothing but sub-maximal fives and singles, you know?
Yeah. That makes sense. I fell into that trap just last week. I was in a peaking phase and I went for a rep max on squat. And it was like, I immediately in retrospect, I was like, I had my last heavy single 2 days after that. And I was like, that was probably a mistake, man.
Absolutely.
But it's so tempting.
That's a mistake I made a bunch of times was I kind of understood the importance of building muscle. I understood the importance of rep PRs being like, hey, we can't just hit a single PR all the time. We're not brand new, right? How do we know if we're getting better? Well, if I'm hitting heavier 8s and 5s and 3s and 10s, that means I'm ready for a new one when I work my way around to it. It's like, yeah, that's a simple way of understanding training, but it's a very effective way of understanding training. So I was like, that was how I derived my confidence that I was ready for a new 1RM is I would need to hit a new either triple PR or double PR to believe I was ready. But the problem is sometimes you hit that like RPE 10 double that really you sold your soul to get it done. And kind of what I start like, and that would be like, okay, I'm ready. I hit a new 2RM. That means I'm ready for a new 1RM next week. And basically over time, I just found that taking that same weight that would have been a PR double and just racking it after a single was really giving me the best of both worlds in that peaking phase of, okay, well, I still got that heavy touch. I still got that technical practice at a very high percentage of 1 rep max, but I don't get that disproportionate fatigue of the second rep. And even more so than the fatigue, I'm not drilling shitty patterns. The last squat that's kind of in my subconscious isn't that death grind second rep with breakdown. It's presumably an RP 9 single with pretty good tech. So the last thing kind of subconsciously in my head going in to that heavy single is a quality single, not a shitty double. And I just found that like switching that mentality of like, let's take a big PB double or triple as my last heavy session, instead just taking the same weight I would do for that and then racking it after one, usually it's less fun. You don't get the rep PR. So it's like, well, maybe I've done this single before. Doing things you've done before kind of doesn't scratch that meathead itch we all have of trying to rep PR all the time, do something you've never done before. Again, super productive mentality, but sometimes that like definitely leads you astray if you like prescribe, if you like lean into that everything needs to be something I've never done before mentality too much, it leads to poor training decisions. So yeah, like it was annoying to me that, oh, I've done this single before, but like start looking at quality. Maybe this is the best I've like ability PRs. People kind of trash them because I think sometimes it's some guys who are like skirting around acknowledging the fact that they're making a poor rate of progression. So they're constantly talking about their ability PRs. But an ability PR for like a heavy weight is a very real thing. The highest quality rep you've ever done at 90% plus is a very, like, that is something you should be patting yourself on the back about. Maybe, you know, in the hypertrophy phase of our training program, we're looking more at total volume PRs. In the strength phase, we're looking more at rep PRs. But really for the peaking phase, we are looking at ability PRs for heavy sub-maximal heavy singles. What's the best I've ever executed this weight? So as soon as I was like, okay, I'll bite my ego and start thinking about going for ability PRs, not rep PRs through the peak, I peaked out a lot smoother for that single, pretty more reliably. That was kind of like a missing component, as I understood building volume through the hypertrophy phase and getting big, very useful for lifting a lot of weight. I understood, okay, well, rep PRs, anywhere from like 8 down to 3, I do want to be hitting rep PRs to give myself a sign that I am in fact stronger than I was last time. But then I don't need to continue riding out that idea of like my preparation is rep PRs until the very end. Making that switch just for the last 3 weeks over to ability PRs and leaving those reps in the tank definitely has allowed like me, my brother, a lot of my athletes to peak out their lifts a little bit more reliably.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, if I remember right, you and Max will cap your heaviest touch at like 95% at the most,
Yep.
right?
Yep,
Yeah.
95% right abouts of what we either are. It's kind of context dependent, right? And this is the tricky part with like giant lifters who are spanning a lot of weight, right? In a preparation, like maybe they start with an 800 E1RM, and by the end they're at a 900 E1RM, right? Big guys tend to detrain a good bit in the off. They're not maintaining towards their peak performance because they can't. It's very unhealthy to do so. Or especially if PEDs are involved, again, you have this weird idea of, wow, I'm spanning a lot of weight in terms of what I could do at the very beginning, versus what I could do at the very end. So then like those bigger athletes like Max or these untested lifters, not Max, would usually be working off of the end number. So it'd be 95% of what they intend to hit. Whereas I think most lifters in training, we should skew our train. Like a lot of the old training programs back in the day would say, use 95% of your actual max, enter that in. It's just better to skew things slightly lighter because a lift you did under ideal circumstances might not be replicatable. So the idea of working off of something that you could do pretty consistently is a good idea. And most guys need to skew towards volume. Heaven forbid you get a couple extra reps by working off a slightly lower number. So I think most lifters just work off of the most you've done clean, right? And the most you've done clean, if we're training for a pause bench, it's the most you've paused. Don't think you're going to beat the system by programming off of your touch and go. And then you're going, I'm going to pause that and more. Program off the lift that you're doing, which is your pause 1RM, right? I've done that one a lot of times because I'm a dummy. But yeah, right. So it's like for Max and I, maybe if it's a lift that's a little detrained, we will take a realistic estimate of what we intend to end at. And our last heavy lift will be 95% of that. Or if we're in a pretty trained shape, which Max and I are the vast majority of the time, if we're not hurt, it'll just be the most we've done, right? To a rigorous standard. 95% of that's the last touch. Then we look for like a 2.5 to 5 kilo chip of our PB at the end of the training cycle.
You've spoken a lot about Ed Coan. I really see the lineage of, work up to an 8 that's 10 pounds heavier than your 8 in the last cycle, right? And just chip it at the end. And I think he was working off of the percentage of goal weight, which I mean, obviously untested lifters. So that makes sense.
Yeah, that's definitely like, it's neither here nor there, right? Like morality of PED.
Oh, of course not.
It's just a necessary thing to acknowledge, right?
Yes.
Like, I think some people, so it's funny because like people will swing super far in either direction where it's like, we should just be copying these big roided up guys, right? Roided up guy, right? I'll raise my hand there. But for the most part, right, like people say, oh, we should just be copying the biggest, strongest guys in the world verbatim. It's like, no, there's context to why they do so little volume. Part of that's the absolute tonnage they're moving. Part of that's their bodily size. Part of that's the PEDs involved, right? So the high level natural lifter at 200 pounds is going to be handling a lot more working volume per week than a high level untested super heavyweight. So it's like, we're fools if we don't acknowledge those contexts, and we should probably be looking to the best in the world in our respective divisions. So our weight class and our testing status to look for kind of best practice, right? We shouldn't be looking to just the strongest guy because he's not like, it always pissed me off when like big untested guys would give like women training programs where they squat heavy once every other week. And it's like, this is a 120 pound woman. You're an idiot, dude. Like that is the most like single brain cell activity I've ever heard in my life. Is just like, well, I'm a big strong guy. If she trained like me, she'd get stronger. And it's no, look at the best women in her class and they're squatting like 4 times a week. It's very different from what you do, right? And some people I think go in the other direction where there's nothing we could learn from Ed Coan. He wasn't natural. And it's like, no, there's a lot of fundamental training principles that kind of apply. Like human physiology still does kind of remain human physiology, exercise selection. the same muscles are emphasized, right? Like there's a lot of underlying things that we could take away, but there's also things that we couldn't take away. And I think it's just having spent enough time around it, you'll start to be able to parse them. But I think when people kind of jump in, they either get the idea that this isn't applicable to me whatsoever, or this is the strongest guy. Of course, I'm just going to copy everything he does.
Right. Like Chad Wesley Smith versus Marissa Inda couple, right? Juggernaut training systems. And he's the super heavyweight, and his low bar frequency is like once every other week, I think, in a strength phase, right? And she squats 3 or 4 times a week.
Yeah. And yeah, that's why we've got high performers that are more relevant to us and high performers that are less relevant to us. And it's like, it's great to be a fan and learn what we can from people in divisions very different from our own, right? Like there's technical things we can take away, but maybe the specifics of a program. If I'm a huge fan of, if you know of Agata Sitko, she won the Sheffield. Okay. She's a lifter from Poland. She's like 21, won the Sheffield by a mile. Amazing lifter. And she does SBD 6 times a week, right?
Wow.
I'm not going to copy that. Like, to be frank with you, I don't think that's a good idea, right? But there are things you can and can't learn. And I think it's just coming in with like, hey, let's just take a semi-nuanced appraisal of this and like think about like, what do I think that's applicable, rather than just wholesale, it's all good, it's all bad.
I just have arrived at the conclusion through some self-honesty and tendonitis that I shouldn't be squatting thrice a week. I twice a week is good for me. And then just have that Ed Coan deadlift day where it's like, I do my deadlift, and then I do a secondary hinge, like an RDL or snatch grip, and then I'll move into like a barbell row and hamstring accessories. And that's just fun, man. It's fun.
Yeah. That'll put some meat on the entire back. Max and I love, like, a lot of the time nowadays, there's like a fatigue management issue because we're not built like Ed Coan. Like that man is built of a different material than the rest of us. So it's like, sometimes
and different proportions.
Absolutely. Right. And so it's like, that like, okay, big like primary deadlift, secondary hinge, free weight barbell row, then hamstring curls and pull-ups. Right. By the time we get to the barbell row, the ability to put in quality work is sometimes a little smoky, but we still like, for portions of the year, we'll try to do a workout very similar to that because it's difficult, because it's just heavy deadlift assistance after heavy deadlift assistance. And it really does, like, because this is something that, like, I saw a Dan Green post a very long time ago that I really, really liked, where he was just like, you don't need to recover, your body does, so train it to, right? Which just kind of alludes to this fact that, like, everybody thinks it's a cut and dry, well, I can recover from this or I can't, right? Mm-hmm. Just like everything else in our body, we could train ourselves to recover from a pretty wide variety of training styles. The question a lot of the time isn't can you, it's should you. Is there a pot of gold if we go through that kind of difficult phase of training ourselves to, Mike T, back in the day when guys were only deadlifting once a month, was pulling heavy 2 to 3 times a week, and he was pulling 850 on a stiff bar, which was more than the roided up, equipped West Side guys, right? So it's like, maybe he's onto something there. And he was like, you can build yourself into these higher frequency training models. Again, but the question is, should you try to work towards that, right? And I think that is like a lot of the question. I always like that. Like, you don't have to recover, your body does. So train it to, if you think it's a good idea. Right now, maybe I could only do pull-ups twice a week. Any more than that, I'm like, I'm getting a little bit of bicep, a little bit of shoulder. It doesn't feel too good. I could ease my way into 3 and then check in 3 months from now, and I could do it. The question is that a good idea, right? And that's something that I always think is like a little bit lost in the frequency equation, is everybody just thinks that, like, somewhere hidden that we can't see, there's an ideal frequency for us, and that it's a static thing, right? And it's like, there's a frequency you could do right now, but that is something that is malleable, and that's something we could change if we are convinced that easing into a higher frequency is something that would benefit us. So then I guess the conversation shouldn't be what frequency can I do? It's what frequency should I build towards? Like, what's a good idea, right? And I've always thought that was like it's a dumb thing to get hung up on, but I've been hung up on that forever. When I hear people talk about like frequency, they're like, it doesn't work for me. And it's like, it could. Mm-hmm. If 2x is working, then do 2x for sure. But like this idea of like people saying this doesn't work for me. And it's like, well, maybe your bench technique is wildly inefficient. So of course your shoulders get banged up when you press heavy 4 days a week. If your technique got more efficient and you did a little bit lower volume, there's a way you could do it. Again, the question is, should you? And I'm not just going to blindly be like, better, higher frequency, always better, like I
Yeah.
don't want to be the frequency guy. I don't want to be the intensity guy. Usually that's a sign of someone who maybe has a good understanding of what works for them, but they don't work with a bunch of different people. And it's like, if coaching has done one thing for me, it's realizing that no, different people do legitimately respond to different things. And that's some combination of their physiology, their technique, but also their psychology. Some people just do not mesh with high frequency training models, and it'd be very difficult to get them to mesh with it. And so if they can make good rates of progression for a prolonged period without it, we'll stay away from it so they don't burn out on training and quit.
Right.
Because you're a hell of a lot more likely to be limited by burning out and quitting and stopping taking your training serious and like just becoming sour on the whole process. Maybe you stop completely, or maybe you're just less invested in your. That's a lot more likely to limit 99% of lifters than how optimized their program was. So it's like part of optimization is avoiding burnout.
Right, right. Yeah, that speaks to something I'd be curious to hear your take on. Like, I kind of have arrived at the conclusion that like I should do the least amount that I can to see steady progress. I think that speaks to earlier when you were talking about jumping to hit the 8-rep max when you could have eked a couple more weeks of progression out. Like maybe you would have been better served going up 2.5% for a couple weeks before you hit that, at the right time. But yeah.
And that's definitely an interesting one, right? Because if we got a couple, like, again, we're all dumb, right? We're not supercomputers. And so we can't take this like extremely level-headed, multifaceted view of training. We need to find things that are functional for us, right? So each of us has our own bias. If my bias is to do too much work, then taking out the monocle of, well, I'm going to view things through the lens of doing the least I need to progress.
Yeah.
That's a very helpful lens for me, the guy who intuitively overdoes it, right? Whereas another lens that you hear tossed around a lot is MRV, maximum recoverable.
Yeah.
And if you as an athlete that's just a little bit lazy, right? Like they tend to like
a la early max, skipping the dumbbell press, right?
Yeah. So it's like, if you know your bias is to do a little bit less, and like if left to your own devices, you aren't, the problem is that you're not training enough. Maybe taking out the other monocle and saying, I'm going to view everything. What's the most I can do and recover? That's going to be a really helpful lens for a long time. And what lens you use might shift with time. I know a lot of people will say that MRV is a very helpful lens for hypertrophy, and maybe a little bit less helpful of a lens for strength training, because it can sneak up on you and get you banged up pretty quickly. Or maybe like minimum effective dose is a helpful lens for strength training, but maybe not the most helpful lens for hypertrophy training. Mm-hmm. I don't really know if I prescribe to those, like it's different between the endeavors. I would say it more kind of depends on the athlete's own biases and the mistakes they can look back and say that they've been consistently been making. But yeah, I use that same lens of what do I need to, it's not what the most I could do today. It's what do I need to do to be ready for next week, right? Mm-hmm. And as I've gotten better at understanding what periods of a program should feel like, how hard touches should be, how much volume I should be building, I have a better sense of how it all flows together. So I have a better sense of how can I be ready for next week, right? And then the other thing that like comes in is like auto regulation, right? Some athletes have just like phenomenal interoception, and they can like kind of feel that overuse injury coming well before it actually comes. Like some people are just very they're physical geniuses, right? They're very in tune with it. And they're like, I'm moving in a poor way. I'm going to adjust that, right? So that athlete is going to be able to effectively auto-regulate and adjust their technique to where maybe they can take that higher frequency, higher volume training model. And you could have someone with the exact same kind of physiology who's kind of a little bit more physically dumb. Maybe they didn't grow up playing sports. They don't have those like that crazy interoception, who might not even notice anything is wrong until it's way too late. And they might march right into those overuse injuries or those soft tissue injuries. And that's something I definitely have noticed coaching more people is some guys have this phenomenal intuition where they're like, hey, if I keep doing this, I'm not hurt yet. I could probably do it for like a couple more months, but if I keep doing this, it's going to be a problem. I'm going to adjust my technique. And those guys who have that level of intuition, you give them the freedom to auto-regulate, and they can take these a little bit more red-lined approach because they can sense when it's about to bust, like when that bubble is about to burst. Because, we all make our best progression when we're pushing the limit. Maybe we are truly redlining it. And some guys have that level of just kind of intuition about their body to where they can redline it a little bit safer than the guys who just brain off. I just go berserk when I train, sicko mode. Those guys are just going to they're not going to know if they're towing the line or if they're above the line for a prolonged period. And that's another thing just I think is interesting and factors in is like some people are just kind of physical geniuses.
Do you think you can kind of learn that intuition through the course of a training career?
Absolutely. Right. I
Yeah.
think that like anything can get better with practice, right? You always get the question of like, well, could you be as good as the guy who took it just as seriously as you and was also kind of gifted? It's like, probably not, right? It's like everybody can get faster.
Mhm.
I'm not going to be Usain Bolt. You're not going to be Usain Bolt because it's like, the whole like, oh, hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe sometimes, but when talent works hard, they usually win, right? But I do think it's like, it is just like everything else, right? The mind, there's a lot of trainable qualities within the mind. There's a lot of trainable qualities within our physiology. We can get smarter. We can get more like mentally acute. We can memorize more things. There's no reason we can't develop better interoception. And I think it just, not only does it come from practice, but it comes from like conscious practice, because we all know somebody's been going to the gym for 10 years and doesn't know any more than they knew after about 1 or 2 years, right? That just showing up isn't enough to get better. You need to be really kind of challenging your mind and like kind of tinkering with this puzzle of how to get stronger to actually learn these things. You need to be paying attention to how that rep felt, paying attention to how you felt the next day when you did that. What techniques can I use that reduce that negative feeling the next day? Well, what is a negative feeling the next day? And what's just soreness, right? What's the difference between my lower back being sore and my lower back being a little bit funky, right? It's very hard to parse that for very new lifters. They don't know the difference. When my back is jacked up, it's like, no, you're just sore, dude. Or vice versa. I think my back is just sore. It's like, no, you're not bracing at all.
You
right?
herniated a disc. Yeah.
You're torching your back. You're not bracing ever. Like, that's crazy, right? So it's like, it's not just practice, but it's conscious and deliberate practice of staying engaged. Again, that's why burning out is like the worst thing that can happen. Is even if you keep showing up, you're no longer mentally engaged, and you're no longer because you can get better so many different avenues. Like we talked about, like great interoception, your training intuition, your understanding of what you need to do at this point in the training cycle to be ready for the next week, not just always doing as much or as little as you can. All of these things are presumably trainable qualities, right? We're very resilient, adaptable organisms. We can train a lot of things. And all of these are different windows through which we can get better, but they all require us to actually be invested in our training and not just like mentally clocked out.
Yeah, being present and kind of mindful, I have a background in like endurance sports, and I've certainly made those errors, and it led to me burning out completely, by the time I was 18, before I went on to college. But yeah. So I think that through that cautionary tale, maybe my own shitty lifting has been bettered, because I don't want to err in that direction. So
it's one of a bajillion reasons why like doing sports at a young age does give you an advantage for lifting. Even if you don't come in stronger, you've just engaged with your physicality. You know what it feels like to work hard. You know what it feels like to recover from working hard. There's a lot of things you just kind of sort out by engaging in difficult physical tasks. Even if like an endurance runner doesn't actually come in with any greater of a bench 1 RM, like GVS has made a bunch of posts about how he felt that doing like a cross-country background greatly boosted his bodybuilding results. He didn't come in pre-loaded jacked. He came in with a gnarly work capacity, which let him handle and recover from more productive hypertrophy work every week. And that translated to a better rate of progression. And the same thing could probably be said about strength sports. Maybe you don't come as that preloaded gun that's already benching 2 plates. Like everybody thinks that's what good genetics is. When it's like, no, some guys do start at a very normal start point. They're just highly adaptable. And part of that could be that work capacity that they were using for running that they're now dedicating to strength training. They're going to be able to do more productive strength training. They understand, like my girlfriend figure skated for the first like 10, 15 years of her life. And it's like, what physiology did she gain from that? Not much. Her work capacity was really nothing special when she started, but she had very good bodily awareness. And on the mental side of things, she understood like the importance of like technique, right? It's not worth doing if the technique is too far off. Like that's like the idea of drilling bad patterns was something that was like hammered into her head. It's like, if you're doing it wrong, fucking fix it. You're actively hurting yourself in the future, right? Like she probably would have seen even more success had she started in something like Olympic weightlifting, where that's very true. Something where the lifts are a little bit dumber. You've got maybe the Eastern European model, which is, hey, I would like to take this beginner lifter, get them elite technique, and then get them stronger. So technique, like it's not worth doing until you can do it really well. And then you kind of have the American model, which is like, hey, beginner lifters have beginner technique. That's fine. As long as by the time you're intermediate, you also have intermediate technique. And by the time you're advanced, you have advanced technique, and there's not a disconnect. Sure, cool. That's not dysfunctional, right? We should probably always be trying to get our technique better alongside our strength. And some guys are only focused on getting their strength better. And that's where like dysfunction might arise there. I'm sure she would have excelled because it's basically seems to be universally accepted among weightlifters that European model for weightlifting is the right way to do it.
Yeah.
Like just because you could do 2 plates with terrible technique, that's a waste of time. You're actively hurting your actual rate of progression because you're going to need to get really clean technique to do 3 plates anyway. What's the point of doing things early? Right.
Yeah.
Whereas like at least in strength sports, we could argue like, oh, neural adaptations, yada, yada, yada. Right. Like maybe we could justify, letting the form slip a lot more than they do.
Yeah.
Right. But it's like, I'm sure she would excel. And the same thing, like she did a couple of strongman contests, and she excelled because a lot of guys, when they start on yoke, they want to do like 1,000 pounds and just take a couple ugly steps and nuke themselves for a week. And she was like, well, what's a yoke supposed to look like? And if I can't move the yoke like that, I'll hang out at the heaviest weight I can, right? And there was like, again, any sporting background, there are lessons that you take away. I'm sure there's things that aren't sports on the mental side that you could take away some pretty sound lessons from, like do your homework.
Right. Yeah, totally. And the homework for the lifter would be the out of the gym variables, I guess.
Absolutely. I call that, dude, like if I didn't do my homework, I'd lift like shit, right? And it's like, those are the things that you do away from, like, it's homework, right? I hate doing homework. I don't mind doing my lifting stuff, but it's the same kind of type of idea. This is something you're tasked to do. Do it however it fits into your free time, but this is 100% on you. No one's going to make you do it, and you're not in a dedicated environment like a gym. It's easier to get yourself to do something when you're in a building dedicated to that thing.
Right.
That's why homework is so hard. Like doing work in class is very easy because you're in class and there's nothing else to do. Yeah. Lifting in the gym and doing your work there, pretty easy because there's nothing else to do there, right? Yeah. It's like saying, hey, you've got 4 meals, you've got this much water, and you've got this bedtime, all in your home environment where you got a lot of distractions. Just make sure those things get done however you like. And so it's the same thing of like allocating time that lets like successful people in academics get their homework done. Same kind of skill.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the exception would be, if you, and maybe this is something you take from, your athletic background too, but just being totally autistic about it and like very tunnel visioned, which is something that I brought in from triathlon and running, which is, from the time I was 8, I was tracking my macros and kind of weighing on a scale in a restrictive way, which was not different conversation, but that was not productive ultimately for my performance. I thought it was, but
well, I think but you hit the nail on the head, right? It's like, these things are only good if they're good, right?
Yeah.
That sounds very obvious, but some people, like their personality type doesn't mesh with trying to be like super type A, measure everything to the gram. Like that just burns them out on it. And it doesn't actually, like you said, it's not actually helping, right? So it's like, it's interesting because in high performers, you can see kind of both camps of like, I'm going to be as obsessively neurotic as I can because that is what makes me feel prepared. And that means when I go to lift that heavy weight, I know I'm ready. Mm-hmm. Or you have people who are a little bit less kind of like autistically hyperfixated. They know what's going on around them and they're choosing to focus the best they can, right? Like a lot of people mention like Mitch Hooper being someone who isn't like hyperfixated on minutia, right? Maybe that's just because he's so genetically gifted, he can get away from it with it, but he's also a very smart guy and he knows what he needs to do to be prepared to win. And he just does those things. It's all about what brings the result, right? And it's like the same thing I always thought was fascinating, right? Like I grew up boxing and you always had like different people, right? You had guys who like just lived in the gym. They're just a gym rat. Like this is everything they've known since they were a young age. And then you have people who are like thinking about broader social causes. And they're like, I'm training hard right now to bring awareness to this. And it's like, wow, those are very different types of like that. They're drawing motivation because you have some bigger, like, you want to gain a platform. This is a means to an end to affect something that ultimately matters more versus the guy who's just like, I love, this is all I think about. This is what I do. And both have produced some of the greatest champions of all time. Right. So it's like, it really comes down to like, and I talk to my athletes, they're like, what should I be? Like, what should my mentality be? And it's like, I couldn't tell you because you can see a pretty wide array of different mentalities among high performers in a bunch of different sports. It's what works. It's not what you think is cool. Just because you think like Andrew House bashing his head on the bar over and over is badass, that doesn't mean it works for you, right?
Yeah.
So it's like everything should be objectively assessed on whether it's giving you returns, because you're already spending all this time to get better. You may as well do a couple of things right to make sure you get strong from it. You're already spending all this time. So we should be like I said, it's the hours of attentive practice, and it's paying attention to, well, what mindset coming into that heavy lift led to the right thing? What mindset about my nutrition led to me actually having the highest compliance? It's all just based on what works.
Yeah. This kind of pops. I do want to circle back to kind of your athletic background, but it just popped into my head as far as mentality. Shane Hunt trains at our gym, which is literally a block away from here. And to watch him, go for a top single, I mean, he is just so relaxed, and just very calm. And, he'll be like, well, I did eat a pound of beef yesterday, but then I just had muffins for dinner, and it's like, that's probably enough macros. But to me, it would be like, dude, you didn't track your protein. You got 250 grams and you weigh 300 pounds. Like, no, that's suboptimal. I wouldn't be able to handle that, but that's,
absolutely,
that's optimal for him.
Yeah, when it's working, right? And it's like eventually maybe, like people say, well, it's just he's getting away with suboptimal because he's genetic free. We're all getting further and further away from homeostasis, and things get harder and harder. And maybe eventually he'll have to clasp that down, or maybe he won't. Maybe it is just what works for him, because at the end of the day, the macros were acceptable. And having that lesser stress during the day led him to be in a better mind state to lift heavy, right? Like all these things kind of add together to across a long training cycle to actually lead to the result. It's not so simple as like, well, he's dedicated or he's not dedicated, or like you said, how hyped up people get, right? You have, you have the whole idea of the arousal curve, right? Which is like you get more and more hyped up and your performance goes up, up, up until you pass a certain point. And then it goes down because you get nervous and you shit the bed. Right. And different lifters fall at different points on that arousal curve. And even within the same lifter, the different lifts might fall at different points on that arousal curve. I've done a lot of bench presses in my life. I'm very confident my technique will not deviate. So the more hyped up I get for a bench press, I get more and more returns. So that is a game of getting as hyped up as I can, getting my adrenaline as high as I can, right? Whereas my deadlift is a little bit less proficient. So it's like I have to get hyped up to a certain point, but if I pass that point, my cues go out the window. And I think a lot of it is people just identify with what they think is cool early in lifting. Like some guys, they just see the guy who's screaming and going crazy, and they're like, that's so badass. I want to be that guy. So they just always try to force themselves onto a point on the arousal curve that isn't actually based on what's getting them results, or vice versa. There's some guys that hate the yelling, and they're like, it's so cool that, like, through history, you got Mike Tusher, Dan Green, Jesse Norris, like all of these very calm lifters. And they're like, it's so cool. He doesn't have to be a jackass showman like that other guy. It's like that guy is doing that because he has to lift the weight.
Right.
And Dan Green is staying calm because he has to lift weight. None of this is because it's cool. It's what they have to do, right? Sometimes it's overcoming fear is why guys get fired up. Some guys stay calm because they shit the bed if they get fired up. It's what they have to do, right? But people are like, it's so cool. He's quiet as a church mouse. Listen, this many plates. And you see those comments and it's like, okay, well, you're coming in with a strong bias here. And instead we should probably just be paying attention to what gets us our PRs and stay in our own lane, right? Like I do find that is a common trait among the lifters that I've coached over time that were just like successful for a long period, is they're not looking around very much. They're pretty fixated on their own variables, their own world, and just doing a good job at what it is they do. They're not so worried about like, well, how does what it is that I do, how does my method compare to other people's method? How are they progressing? Oh, I feel bad about myself because I saw some guy lift more. Like usually they just don't care. They're busy focused on, well, I've got a session tomorrow. I don't have time to be fretting about some guy that deadlifted 1,000 in Russia. I'm busy focusing on making sure I eat this meal that fucking is not tasting so good anymore. I'm just trying to get this meal down, right? Like, I think that's something that my brother does phenomenally, is Max is in his own world always. Like everybody that knows him, that's like a common observation about Max, is Max does not give a fuck about what's going on around him, doesn't give a fuck about other people's personal lives. He just like in a wholesome way, but he's like very focused on like, I'm preparing for that next session. It's a rest day. I'm preparing for the next session. Like I'm executing I know what my process is. I've got some theories as to the things I need to do to get better. I'm just wholeheartedly looking at those things and what's the best I can do them. Like, how would an expert execute the plan that I think works best for me? And he doesn't have time or energy to be constantly worrying about, but there's a 15-year-old that's lifting more than me and I'm 27. It's like, I don't care. Like, I'm busy trying to get stronger, brother.
Right. Yeah, yeah. And I think you really did Max a service there because from what I understand, you completely ignored him until he was about 10 years old. So that probably facilitated, his ability to just be in his own world and to have a rich imaginative life on Skyrim.
It
So
must be. It must be.
and I'm taking that from your own mouth from a large lads
True.
episode.
This
I'm
is
not,
true.
yeah, throwing shit. I had a similar thing with my brother. I was so tunnel vision about my athletic stuff that I regret. That's a thing I regret now. But anyway,
Yeah, well, I'm
um,
glad. I'm glad we started talking when he was like 11.
oh,
Otherwise
right.
we
We
would
had to
just
bring
kept
him to the
going.
Y.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and like, yeah, no, it was looking back. I have no idea why it turned out that way. Like me, my brother, and my
Yeah.
sister just did not like. We didn't. There was no like bad blood at all. We just
Right.
didn't talk to each other for like the first 10 years.
Yeah.
And like we're pretty close clustered in age. We're each 2 years apart. Is looking back, everybody's got their stories about like my girlfriend also has two siblings. She's the oldest, same as me. They're all about 2 years apart, same spacing. And they've all these stories of like playing together and then getting in fights. And it's like we didn't get in fights, we didn't play together. Like, man, you got a lot of stories that I
Yes.
just do not have.
Yeah. Yeah. It does occur to me that a lot of what we've been talking about as far as keys to success boils down to that self-knowledge and self-honesty, knowing your optimal arousal curve, and knowing kind of having that intuitive sense of, whether this is, like you said, I tweak my low back or that's just spinal erector fatigue, right? But yeah.
Yeah, and it's a tough one to navigate, really, because it's like for the most part, even the people who are physical geniuses, you learn through a trial by fire. They learn a lot faster, and then some people who are very unphysically aware of their own body learn a lot slower. But the only way to learn is kind of towing that line, and maybe you do tweak your back a little bit every now and then. You're like, that thing I was feeling the week before was bad, right? That wasn't just
Yeah.
erector fatigue, right? Like take a note of those things. It's like that's why, it's a big thing on the internet. We have access to so much information. You get a lot of newer guys that want to understand everything before they throw themselves into it. And that's a fool's errand. It's impossible because there's so many things that can't really be communicated via video, can't be communicated via podcast. They're feelings. And the only way you can contextualize those feelings is to experience them yourself. There's so many, like people want to have a great understanding before they throw themselves into it. It's like, that's backwards. The only way to gain a great understanding is to truly throw yourself into it and consume information while you do so.
That makes a lot of sense. So you're what, 11, 12, you're in the boxing gym, you're doing way too many push-ups, you're afraid of lifting because it'll slow your speed or something, right?
True.
So
That's
how
what I was
does that
told.
Okay, yeah. So you broke out of that mindset yourself and decided you wanted to pursue lifting to help boxing, or was it just I like lifting right away?
Yeah, so much the same as lifting. I was just a gym hero, right? I did a couple of smokers, which is like an unsanctioned boxing event to gain like pseudo competitive experience. There's a crowd, it's 3 3-minute rounds, but it's not actually something that's a sanctioned event. It's like an
Okay.
unsanctioned meet almost, right?
Yeah.
Pretty common practice to give people like the actual like nerves and experience. And I did a couple of those because my coach told me to, but like I never really had much itch to compete, which looking back was very weird because for the age, I was quite good. I was tall, I was quick, I was pretty strong naturally. And I just spent more time doing it than most kids because most kids have some kind of life other than exercising. And it's like the
Right.
second I found out about exercising, it's all I did. Right.
Oh,
Like I
yeah.
like that stuff. Like I would get up, like when I was 10, I was getting up at like 5 in the morning to run for an hour. No one was
Eight.
making me do it. No one told me to do it.
Yep.
Right. But I was like, I love this. I like exercising. It's cool. Right. So I was
Yeah.
pretty good. And never like I had no interest in it. And I just wanted to keep spending as many hours a day training as I could and getting better. And I had this actually same hang up that I had later with my lifting is, well, oh, I got to deload before competing. That's time that I'm not getting better. I'm
Yeah.
not going to do that shit. Fuck that. That's
Yeah.
missing a couple of days. I don't miss days of training. I'll
Right.
just keep training. It's very weird looking back on it. But because I was a bit of a gym hero, I would very, very regularly spar people that weren't exactly my weight, right? You spar with who you got, right? So I had a couple of guys I was sparring with that were a reasonable amount bigger than me. And they were pretty good and they were beating my ass. And I was like, I don't like getting my ass beat. I was like, my coaches looking back, a little unethical. They were letting me get concussed as shit
Oh,
every day
man.
for about 3 months. And I remember like being in class, I couldn't read the stuff on the papers. I was like heavily concussed. Like, I was just like, cool, that boxing is badass. And I'll just go back and just get my ass beat again. And I'd be like, damn, that's crazy. So I was like, eventually I was like, I'm tired of having a concussion. So I'm going to figure out, like, I was like, I'm going to get a little bit bigger because I'm not going to leave. I'm not in a weight class. I'm not going to leave a weight class. And that'll I know they'll let me spar the same people. So that'll give me a little bit of an advantage. And then I also like started watching more film of high level performers in boxing, which is something that like hadn't really occurred to me until the age of 14, 15. I just trained and did what my coaches said. And I started like, well, maybe I can learn things from watching people better. It kind of came about a little later, just didn't cross my mind. So I started doing that, started getting a little bit better understanding of like what it was that they were doing better than me and why I was getting my ass beat. And at the same time, I started, at first they had one cable machine in the corner of the boxing gym. And I just looked at the pictures on the cable machine and I was like, I think I just did like hammer rope curls and tricep press downs. And I was
Classic.
like, and maybe some cable crunches. So I was like, okay, cool, awesome. And like my arms got stronger. Like it was cool. I was like, okay, my arms got a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger. Even just that engaging from no resistance training, like how to train for punching power aside. I'm going to make a video about that eventually because I do have my own theories. But just going from not being strong to being like slightly trained makes you. And if you already know how to punch, right? That's the big thing. Is I've been punching since I was like 8. Right, knowing how to make it not just an arm punch, but a whole body thing. It's more explosive than it is strong. People that try to punch strong, punch weak. Right, people that try to punch fast, punch hard. And so that's how I saw returns. I was like, okay, cool. And I went to started going to the YMCA, started just doing some basic lifting, and I saw great returns to my boxing. I was just a little bit more. I got to the point pretty quickly. Obviously, I've got pretty good genetics for this. I was stronger than the guys that were beating me up. So it's like, okay, cool. I can infight a little bit. I can kind of muscle them around the ring. That opens up a huge option of what to do that I didn't have before. Because I was very tall and skinny, not very tall, but I was 5'10" and I weighed like 135. So I was tall for my weight class. So I was very used to fighting guys shorter than me. Thus, I was fighting with these guys who were bigger than me and taller than me. I didn't really know what to do. So I learned how to fight like the shorter guy, stay on the inside, kind of push them around a little bit and like invest more heavily, like thrown to the bottom. Basically, I figured it out and I had like, it was a great payoff moment of like, oh, hard work pays off. One of the guys that was just whooping he wasn't actually trying to get better. Like usually when you're outclassing someone, you like restrict yourself to like maybe jabs only, left hand only to make it a challenge so you get better too. So both of you get quality work. 3 months of beating my ass and he never did any of that shit. Really nice guy. I think he's a psychopath, right? And so like,
sure, yeah.
I started doing my like research and I came up with my plan and I bulked up a little bit. And I want to say he took 3 weeks off because he had like a cram school because he was a couple years older than I was. He was cramming for the SAT. He took 3 weeks off and he came back and he was just a little bit detrained. And I beat the fuck out of this guy.
Nice. You caught him at the right time.
I know. I was like, he's a little detrained. I've got 3 weeks more mass on me. I beat the fuck out of this guy. And it made my week. I was so happy. Like I was very excessive. I really laid it on him. And like I went home and I was like, finally, he's concussed. I'm not concussed. Hard work pays off. All's right with the world. You do your research, you do your training, and it all pays off.
That's great. One thing that stands out to me there is 3 weeks more mass. That's such a thing that doesn't apply outside of your teenage years. I feel like where
right.
you can
Not
have a
brand new
noticeable
living.
improvement in 3 weeks and muscle.
Yeah, no, like I remember, like I was like, damn, my bench went up 20 pounds in that 3 weeks, dude. You're fucked.
Nice. So you get that closure, and then at what point did lifting become more the priority for you?
I think it was like a natural transition. The gym that I was training at was kind of going out of business. And then I was looking at a couple other gyms and some of them kind of sucked. And like, I didn't think they were doing a good job actually developing their athletes. I was like, I don't want to go there. Like some of them were just like dumb. We spar hard and nobody actually tries to get technically better culture, which it's fun, but it's not actually how you get better. And that always annoyed me. So I was kind of like trying to figure that out. I was navigating that. And I also was just like enjoying my lifting every day. So then I was like, and then I basically just came about that I kept training. And then I wanted to do a couple other sports over the next like year. So then I just didn't have time. And I gradually like it phased out and then I would go back and train for a little bit. But I wanted to do track and then I wanted to play a season of this. And right, I wanted to just like play a couple other sports. but the whole time lifting just kind of stayed constant in the background because I was like, this is just training, right? Because that's what I'd always loved since I was 10 is just this idea of training. And it's just like, this is another form of training and it's numerical, which I like, right? It's like, for some reason, I never even thought to like time my running very much because that could have been numerical. And I'm sure that would have scratched an itch like early on, but I never really got into that because I wasn't actually doing distance running or track or anything. I was just going down to the field and then running until I couldn't run anymore and then walking home. And that was just like, that's what I did. Yeah. And so I'd never, like, there was no numbers associated. There's no overload. There's no measurable thing that I'm getting better. All I knew is every time I would just end dead tired, which I liked going home. I just liked walking home tired. Like,
the sensation of fatigue. It's like, you're probably releasing some cannabinoids, in your brain. And it's satisfying. And I think a lot of people are not really concerned with, improving fitness parameters. They're concerned with achieving that feeling.
Yeah, well, I think that's you derive enough of the, like, unless you're training for something specific to improve your performance in a specific competitive endeavor, just training to that point of fatigue is probably enough to derive most of the health benefits from most forms of exercise. You're going to get your bone density increases. You're going to get your cardiovascular health, right? Like it's like Stan Efferding, I think, always likes to differentiate between training and exercise. Mm-hmm. Just exercising will get you most of the results. So that's a very functional model to give people. He's like, hey, just go till fatigue. You should be sore the next day. That's what we're going to do. And you only really have to get smarter when you start like chasing higher and higher level of performance. And then you need to understand the nuances of what does training for a specific fitness outcome entail.
Right. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
And I didn't get that when I was boxing. I didn't understand that I was training for a specific outcome. I was exercising, right?
Yeah.
Very, very rigorously. But I was just trying to leak.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, in the morning I run till I'm tired. I go to school. Leave school, and then I do boxing like drills for an hour at the gym, which is like standard stuff: jump rope, heavy bag, double end bag, speed bag, footwork drills, the standard. And then after the hour of boxing, like kind of training, we would do 30 minutes to an hour of sparring a couple times a week, depending on what like how many people were around at the time, but we would spar afterward. So, my coach is like a big believer in like pre-fatigued sparring. Cause if you don't know how to fight tired, you don't know how to fight. And I was like, that's interesting because a lot of like, sports science stuff would tell you the opposite. Working on motor skill should be done fresh. And it's like, I looking back, I think that was a good idea. Cause most of the time you're tired, but yeah, no, I didn't understand that, like, okay, well, all of these things that I'm doing are to supplement that sparring. If I had understood the hierarchy that, these drills are to support technical elements of this sparring, and the running is to support the cardiovascular demands of this sparring, they could have been directed a lot better, and then I could have seen better outcomes in my sparring. I had very good outcomes in the sparring just because nobody else was there was no other like 13-year-olds that just like were at the gym 6 days a week, twice a day.
Right.
So even if it wasn't organized, I was doing quite well. But looking back, it could have been quite a bit better had I been given that guidance of like, this isn't just self-torture. This is training for a specific outcome,
Yeah. Well, I definitely was guilty of doing way more than I needed to, and I think for me, it was more of an anxiety thing. Like I need to test to confirm that I'm still this fast. Right. Yep. So I would there was a point when I first started training where I would run. It was, our neighborhood was a loop and it was like a mile loop. It's actually 1.1 miles, but I'd run that as hard as I could, like every day. And I needed to see my time decrease. This is when I was in 4th grade, when I first started running. I never wanted to run. I just realized I was not the fastest. I was not the strongest, but as far as presidential fitness standards in elementary school, but I had this thing in me where I was like, I have to be the best at something or I'm worthless. That didn't come from my parents. It just came from some dumb shit in my head. So I was like, I can probably beat people at the mile run if I train for it, because nobody's going to run. And then I would get to school after that and I would run. It was 200 yards around our like playground. So I'd run 8 laps as hard as I could during recess,
Dude, those presidential fitness tests, that was us autists' day to shine, dude.
Absolutely.
I remember like that. I was like giddy and so excited every time those were coming up. I'm like, dude, I'm gonna smoke my whole grade in push-ups again. Let's fucking go.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, but when I was like 6 or 7, I was very lucky to have a bedroom that had like a literally a secret door in the closet that was like this tiny passageway that opened into this library. We had a cool house. And
Yeah, sounds very cool.
yeah, it was a perfect kid house. But my dad had this Arnold's Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding, and
Yep.
so I was reading that when I was like 6 or 7. I was like, this is so cool. Mom and dad, can I lift weights? Of course not. You'll stunt your growth. Well, I'm 5'8", so I think I stunted my growth in other ways anyway. But
I'm with you.
yeah,
Reason I was max. I wasn't eating enough
totally. Yeah,
for
yeah. I was
boxing because I
very
was like,
restrictive.
well, I was just being told over and over that it's an advantage that I'm skinny.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and so I was never actually restricting my eating. That was the weird part. Like I my whole life I've had no appetite. Yeah, I could probably eat once a day and I feel great.
Wow.
And ever since I was a kid, I was like, yeah, I eat when I'm hungry, which is never. And everybody
Yeah,
was
right.
telling me, like, dude, it's awesome that you're so tall for your weight class.
Oh,
So I was like, I'm tall. I'm 5'10". I'm not tall, but I'm like, damn, I'm so tall. And I also hit my growth spurt early. So at one point I was tall.
yeah.
I was a gigantor in 6th grade. And I thought that would continue,
Yeah.
but then lo and behold, never eating, it did not continue.
Right.
Right. So
Yeah.
it's like if somebody had told me like you could be taller, like I would have understood that immediately. And I would have started chugging milk. Like, I won't be tall. That sounds sick. So it's
Absolutely.
like
Yeah.
if somebody had told me like, oh, you're growing, you have to make a conscious effort to eat,
Mm.
that would have clicked. But everybody just told me it's awesome that you're so skinny. And it's
Right.
good for boxing. Like the fact that I
Yeah.
was skinny but strong is pretty ideal. If you
Yeah.
can be rangy and not give away strength, that's what you should be for boxing, right? And
Totally.
whereas Max was just eating everything under the sun, and he was like a portly little boy who
Yeah.
hit puberty and then got way taller than
Right.
his body had a lot more resources to grow.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, well, my brother's like 6'2", 6'3", so same thing. And he had a normal childhood for the most
Yeah.
part compared to my self-imposed, weird childhood. But I was interested in lifting. I just didn't have access to it. And I also had this desire to be the best at something. And so running, right? And then that segued into triathlon because again, just like with the boxing, you're the only 13-year-old at the gym. There's no 12-year-olds doing triathlons, so like you quickly ascend to like nationally ranked, right? And I was like, oh, I'm gonna go to the Olympics and stuff. Well, very quickly, freaking Lukas Verzbicas, I'll never forget him, comes in at duathlon nationals and kicks my ass, and then it's like, and more of those people who are real athletes come in, and it's like I was still very good, but I was not as good as I thought I was or would be,
It's funny. That's how powerlifting was, raw powerlifting when I first got into it.
Yeah.
It was a lot more realistic for someone who's like maybe averagely genetically inclined to reach the bottom end of elite because it was pretty niche, and as it's become a lot more popular, and it's more popular than I think people give it credit for because it's one of the most accessible things to train for.
Yeah.
Gyms have barbells, they have squat racks, they have benches, and it's just logical to kind of train for 1RM. So yeah, there's an X number of people that compete within the sport of powerlifting, but the number of people that train for basically powerlifting is actually quite a bit higher than that. And the ones that genetically excel are very likely to be told, hey, you should do a powerlifting meet. So the gene pool for powerlifting, I think, is actually a bit bigger than what people think it is because so many people are exposed to squat, bench, deadlift. And the people that show extreme levels of genetic promise are going to come across someone saying, hey, you should do a contest, right? So it's like, it's like if there was a bunch of people, if pickup basketball was just being played all over the place, right? Every gym had people that were like constantly shooting 3-pointers. The ones that are tall and inclined would be told, hey, you should go compete, right? Every gym across America has guys squatting, benching, and deadlifting. So that's something I do think is interesting. But because the pool of people that actually took powerlifting seriously was so small back then, and like the squat racks were always empty, back when I was like starting up in like 2013, 2014-ish,
Wow.
I never had to wait for a squat rack. Nobody was doing it. So it was like, you could just take this seriously. And like back then it's like, wow, you have a 1,500 total. You are a god amongst men, right? And it's like, there's 12-year-olds doing that now.
Yeah.
And so
Quite
it's like,
literally.
it was like a real eye opener for some of the guys that got a big ego because they got in early and they're like decent sized guys. So they got to like 15, 1,600, very respectable. They're pretty good at powerlifting. And then, like you said, more real athletes start burning out on, like they're like, oh, I'm done with my college football.
Yeah.
I'll just try powerlifting. And they come and fucking smoked everybody. And they're like, oh, fuck.
Yeah.
I was here because I was winning because I was like the only guy here.
Yeah,
Shit.
yeah. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Blaine Sumner like accidentally squatted 1,000.
Yeah, when he
Yeah.
was playing fucking Division II college football, he was
Right.
like in their weight room squatting like a grand in like a
Yeah.
single ply suit. Crazy.
Yeah. So when was your first competition?
I was 17. So let's just call that 2016.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, something around there. That was I
Yeah.
did my first meet.
Was that AAU?
My first one was USAPL, the
Okay.
USAPL
Okay.
state
Yeah.
championship. No idea. Like I prepped, not the worst, not the best. Like I hear most people describe their first prep. I'm like, I did better than that. That's pretty good for me. You know, like I had this idea of like, okay, well, you're going to train a little bit more reps further away and you practice singles a little closer. There was a basic framework there, and it actually worked out well enough. I think at my first meet, I squatted 452. Maybe I bench pressed about 300 pounds, and I deadlifted 520. All in all, pretty good day for me. It was a very positive experience. For some reason, I just like the same thing with competing. It's always been is like, wow, that was a positive experience. That was so fun. And then there's just no itch to do it again. Like it just like that doesn't happen for me, right? Like
Yeah.
I will compete. I'm not scared of competing anymore. Like thinking that I'm gonna spend time away from getting stronger, but I just don't have this tremendous itch to do it. I think that as I get stronger and stronger, it seems like a shame not to, because that's usually, I think, lame for people to not actually go compete when they reach very high levels of strength, to compare apples to other people. So I don't want to be who I would deem lame. So I'm going to do it, and I continue to do it. But I didn't get that itch. And then I did an internship at a gym in Seattle. The owner of that gym, Bull Stewart, is a legend of drug-tested powerlifting. And he had a falling out with he was actually the guy who used to host the USAPL meets in Washington. And he had a falling out with the USAPL. Don't know why. Whatever it might have been. I think I know a couple of people. I'll ask them. I'll figure out what it was. But he had a falling out with the USAPL there. So they took away the state championship from him. He was friends with the guy that runs the AAU, which AAU powerlifting, obviously a very small thing. I'm told it was actually, there was like American Drug Free Powerlifting Federation, something like that, that split off into the AAU powerlifting, and it split off into the USAPL. One of those blossomed into what drug tested powerlifting is in America, and then one of those blossomed into something no one's ever heard of. They're like the basketball league. So is powerlifting comes from?
Right.
Yes. Yeah, the basketball league. Yep, that's them. And so he was affiliated with like this smaller federation, and I had enough, like the internet and powerlifting was enough that I knew I was competing in a B League fed. You know, oh, you know, you're gonna win nationals. And I was like, I've seen what the guys at USAPL nationals do. I understand what this is. Like I like there were some people there that didn't know what's going on, that they were like, oh yeah, dude, I'm the best in the world at powerlifting. And it's like, dude, you total 1,000 pounds as a 250-pound man. You are so far from the best in the world. You would be very upset if you learned what people are doing at your body weight. But like, it was like this nice little ignorance is bliss bubble of like the people at this small gym. And I was smart enough at the time to bite my tongue and not just get shunned for reality checking people or something. I was like, okay, I know better results are going on elsewhere, but it's an opportunity to, it's a meet is a meet, you know, like they weren't passing like crazy high squats or anything. The squats were walked out. Like it was pretty standard stuff. So it's like, it goes in like my open powerlifting. Cool. That's fine. And so the guy that I worked for talked me into doing a meet he holds on a beach in Washington, which is a little uneven on the ground, but it was cool. It was a cool view.
Oh, you were literally squatting on the sand.
No, they put boards over it.
That's still pretty sketchy though.
Yeah,
That's
it was something, right?
Yeah.
It might have been a patch of grass they put it on, but it was not concrete.
Yeah.
And that would like, again, I had a pretty good performance. It was a positive experience. I walked away. And again, I just didn't know, like, okay, cool. That was what it was. Back to training. And then my third and final powerlifting meet was AAU Worlds, right? Bull wanted to bring a team to AAU Worlds, and I was like, sure. So I hitched a car ride with him and his brother, drove us down to Las Vegas, and I competed there. And again, great experience, pretty good meet. Was having some issues with my squat, which obviously looking back, it was because I didn't know what I was doing. But my bench and my deadlift were progressing very well. I think this all happened in about a cluster of about less than a year, whereas those three meets were clustered together. And I went from like a 520 deadlift at the first one to 589 by the third one. Things were progressing very well. My training was getting, this whole time I was like obsessively binge watching videos. Back then, Supertraining was like, if you went to
So
Supertraining,
classic.
well, like
Those
that was like the
those
pinnacle of the
early
sport.
videos.
Yeah, if
Yeah.
Mark Bell flew you out, that was like the pinnacle of the sport. You got all this exposure. You would make a video about like how you program or your favorite assistance work or how you do this lift, and it would you gain a bunch of notoriety. And he would have tested guys out, he would have untested guys out. So it's funny because like a lot of people that got into it newer don't know at one point being on the Mark Bell Powercast was the pinnacle of powerlifting. That was
Yeah.
like the best thing that could happen to you. And nowadays you say, oh, you know, the power cast and the poop jokes, and they're like, what the fuck are you talking
Right.
about?
Yeah.
You
And
know,
the
as a guy like,
barefoot shoes and the mobility. It's definitely, I mean, it's evolved as he's evolved, right?
mhm.
But I remember the OG days. I was watching that when I was in undergrad and starting to get into
Yeah.
powerlifting.
Yeah. At
Yeah.
one point,
Yeah.
that was like Max and I were like that. Like one day, Mark Bell will fly us out. Doesn't do that shit anymore, but
Yeah.
that was the idea.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, the other thing about that channel is like his commentary, I remember on the workouts was genuinely funny. I would actually laugh out loud at like the shit that he was saying in the voiceovers, you know. So
Oh, yeah. Mark Bell
that was
was
some
always a
quality
goober.
YouTube. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, it's funny because like it soured me a little bit when he started taking himself like more and more seriously,
Yeah.
because that was like what made him so likable. It's like when he was fat or when he was lean, he'd be like, "Oh yeah, like I'm a fatty at heart." Like he was always just a
Yeah.
funny guy who didn't take himself very seriously, who also happened to know a good bit about powerlifting. You know, he coached Stay and Efforting, like he's got the accomplishments, and he was just like a funny, lighthearted guy that didn't take
Yeah.
himself too seriously. And then, you know, like it does being rich and famous, he started taking himself a little too seriously.
Yeah. Yeah. Tragic. But I'll still tune in every once in a while if they have
Every
a good
now and then,
guest.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't have it in me to dislike Mark Bell. I just like him less than I did. You
Right.
know,
Right.
he brought
Yeah.
me a lot of good YouTube watching back in the day. You know, a lot of good information that helped my
Yeah.
lifting. So it's like you know, he could be pretty bad. He could go a bit worse than he is, a good bit worse than he is now. I mean, I like Mark Bell. I don't like his new stuff, but I like Mark Bell.
Yeah.
Like it took a lot for me to be like, I hate that guy now.
Yeah. And it's interesting too that back then, like their knee sleeves were legit, whereas now you're basically putting on like, you know, the equivalent of knee wraps if you get like the extra small inserts or something.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, that's the issue that's plagued powerlifting across its entire history, right? Is we won't crack down on equipment, so it becomes progressive to artificially inflate the numbers, right?
Yeah.
At first it was raw, and then knee wraps were told like we need knee wraps to keep our knees safe. And people are like, oh, it's for safety. But like ace bandages, and then they got a little stiffer, and they got a little stiffer, and then they
Yeah.
said, well, if we need knee wraps to keep our knees safe, we need this squat suit to keep our hips safe. It's for safety.
Right.
And
Yeah.
then they got stronger, and then they became multiply. And then we said, wow, this has gotten kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Let's do a little reset. And so we reset back to initially it went from, okay, we're going to stop using the suits, but knee wraps stayed on.
Yeah.
You know, and this was about 2012 era. And then sleeves were more accessible for people to train in. They're less painful. And we realized you don't need knee wraps to squat without your knee blowing up.
Mhm.
If anything, they probably slightly increase the chance of that happening by letting you squat more than you can.
Yeah.
So, okay, cool. We got these knee sleeves to keep our knees warm,
Mhm.
right? Why don't we wear nothing? I don't know, right? But it's like, oh, they're just for warmth. And logically, like it always has, they get a little thicker, they get a little thicker, they get a little thicker to artificially inflate the progression of the sport, because we need to have that. The records are going up and up and up,
Yeah.
right? The same thing happens with weightlifting, but they just change the weight classes.
Mhm.
You know, they've kept a good job like avoiding artificial inflating of the records via equipment. But the records are kind of nebulous because at different periods you have different levels of actual testing. So they're like,
Yes.
okay, we're just going to throw all the old records out. That way we can enjoy 10 years of new records, new records, new records.
Mhm.
And that way we can feel like there's some progression within the sport. You know, if they didn't do that, there would have been a big gap where they actually started testing people a bit, and
Right.
there wasn't records broken for like 20 years, right?
Yeah.
And you know, it's the same thing with like the deadlift bar. At one point, we just had stiff bars, and somebody said the deadlift bar. I don't even know, that wasn't that's the only one that wasn't justified for like safety or warmth. It's just to fucking lift more weight.
Yeah.
And
Right.
then like again, like anything else, if you give a little bit, you're gonna take a lot, right?
Totally.
You get the kabuki bar, an even bendier bar. And my get rich quick scheme is I'm going to figure out how to build a bar that's even bendier. And of course, every big will use it because they want records broken.
Yeah.
So that's my $1 million idea. Is just
That's
one up the
great.
kabuki bar
Yeah.
and just go use a pool noodle that doesn't leave the ground.
Pool noodle. That would be perfect. I was thinking spider web or like spider, but the pool noodle's better. Yeah, I'd love to see a pool noodle deadlift at maybe like the Rogue Invitational or something.
Yeah, it's a shame because it obscures comparison. It's like how
Yeah.
much would Ed Coan have squatted under the same circumstances as John Hack? What would their totals have looked like if you gave Ed Coan a deadlift bar? Given that he was deadlifting 900 on a stiff bar, he'd probably be right up there with John. He probably would have bench pressed less. But so the real deal break, so the real like kind of question of who's stronger at about 220 body weight comes down to this impossible question of people like, well, basically Ed Coan was that equipment did nothing. It did something. Get the fuck out of here. Or he did this with straps down. Elite lifters will figure out how to get weight out of anything, dude.
Yeah.
It's it's very hard to say. He would out squat John. I feel pretty confident.
Mm.
But the question is it enough to offset the difference in how much better John is at benching if you want to make that comparison? And it's impossible to answer. It's all just kind of guesses. And that it's one of the only numerical sports where you can't make numerical comparisons because we let the standards slide all over the place.
Yeah. Well, what I'm hoping for is a truly raw division where it's no belt, no sleeves, no wraps, no shoes, no singlet, just your ass out, that would be perfect. But I think it would be hard to televise. Yeah, that's
the only way.
That's right. Yeah. The other thing about that Hack Coan conversation, which has been, rehashed so many times, but we haven't seen him actually filling out 220. I mean, he only did that at Ghost Clash last weekend because he didn't make the water cut.
I think we have. I could be wrong. Hold on.
Yeah. Okay.
Let me double. I'm going to double check that. I think he did a no cut meet.
Okay. Never mind.
Point, but no. Like, do not listen to me. So he's weighed in at 210.
Okay.
Which I don't know if that was. I'm guessing because he walks around like more towards 220. I'm guessing that was the same kind of deal as the Ghost Clash where he began the cut. It was not going to plan, so he pulled the plug very early. So we haven't seen especially we have not seen a John Hack cutting to 220, but even just weighing in at 220, because realistically it would be more applicable to what Ed Coan did to see him weigh in at a true 220, not bulk up to 230 and then water cut, because Ed Coan had a day of weigh-in. And John is getting a 24-hour weigh-in. So if we're trying to get like the most apples to apples thing we can, it would be better to see like John just weigh in at a true 220. That's probably a little bit more apples to apples with what Ed Coan did at 220. Like I said, I reckon you give Ed Coan a kabuki bar, he'll also be in that 940, 950 range. So I still do think they're pretty comparable there. I actually do wonder if John could pull 900 on a stiff bar. I don't think so. I don't think so. I could be wrong, but I don't think so. Obviously, John is the far superior bencher, even though his bench is down right now. That's just the nature of the beast, right? People are like, that's what frustrates me is when people were like, ooh, this tested lifter, his numbers are down right now. Looks like he's off cycle. And it's like, well, even the untested lifters have these dips where they're trying to get that lift back up to par. He's not off cycle. I'll tell you one thing, John Hack is not off cycle.
I saw the anadrol in his face,
Yeah. So it's like, when performing at these very high levels, it takes a while to get these things back. If you have an injury, you have some kind of setback, you need to get momentum back on your side. Like I remember people being like, this is damning evidence against a couple of tested guys that, oh, this lift is deflated. That means he was on before and he's not now. It's like, I don't think people understand how fickle it is to maintain such a, we're hyper specializing into such a weird niche of human physiology, which is these arbitrary 3 motions performed once. Right. And it's like maintaining world-class performance on that, especially for athletes in higher weight classes, is fickle as shit. And it's like, I'm not even making a claim whether he is or isn't natty. So, that people can leave me alone on that. But people being like, oh, yeah, sure. The reason Ray Williams' squat went down was because he got food poisoning. Fuck yes, if I got food poisoning the day before I did a heavy squat, my squat would be down. Would yours not? that means you suck at squatting. Like, of course, losing 20 pounds. What? You
Yeah.
would like people,
Yeah.
the same
It's
people that are like, that's not a real excuse. Like, how would he get that much weaker? Would happily put in their Instagram caption, "Oh, I was weak today because I got like." It's a
Oh,
good
dude, I
excuse for
love the
food.
Instagram excuses. I mean, I do it as a joke, you know, like I put handicaps or whatever on my dumb lists. But yeah, it's so crazy what people will say, like to
Yeah, I
qualify.
just try to not say anything,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
it's one of those things. It's like everybody's got circumstances.
yeah,
Like I feel like that's a commonly accepted thing in fighting, right?
yeah,
Is you don't make excuses before the fight because the other guy probably also had injuries in preparation. It's
yeah,
not because everybody has it. It's the same thing that like frustrates me in powerlifting. And people are
yeah,
like, I'm not having like I'm going to pull out of this meet because I'm not having a perfect prep.
yeah,
Most people aren't having a perfect prep. It's very rare to have a perfect prep where you don't
totally.
have some aches and pains and you pick up some small injuries. Like it's very, very rare to make it all the way through.
Yeah,
Your goal is to show up as healthy as you can in the best shape you can, to
yeah,
show up against the other people that tried to do the same. Thinking it's arrogant to think you're the only person. Everybody else is having a perfect meet. You're the
absolutely.
only person who's injured a little bit, right?
Yeah,
So I'm going to pull out. It's like, no, they're all injured too.
yeah,
You're the only one pulling out, right? Like,
yeah,
yeah, there's a certain margin of injury where it's like, yeah, probably not
uh,
good to do. But for the most part, I try to stick to like, you show up and do your best. If you have to take a token lift because of injury, you still show up. I like my lifters
yeah,
to like not. I don't like pulling out of meets. Um, but yeah, I think that's like it's something that's accepted in fighting. It's just like do not give
yeah,
those,
yeah.
like and if you give them afterward, if you win and you give them afterward, you're a badass who won with whatever injury. And if you lose, you sour grapes, pussy excuses, right?
Right. Yeah.
You're only allowed to bring those up if you win, right?
Yeah. In spite. Yeah. Because then it
Yeah.
becomes in spite
It's
instead of
just to add
because. But
exactly. You're
yeah.
like it's just adding to what I did, right? Then it's
Right.
cool,
Yeah.
right? That's the
Well,
only time
yeah.
it's cool. But yeah, for the
Well,
most, go ahead. You're
I
good.
was just gonna say, well, my excuses are usually like the fan was too loud kind of
I
thing,
mean,
you know, or the
can
door
throw
was
you off.
propped. Exactly. That breeze, if it comes
No, you
in
gotta
wrong,
listen.
you got to
You
miss
gotta.
groove.
No, no, no. I think you need to take a more positive mindset.
Ah,
You got to
okay.
start writing loud fan PR,
Oh,
right?
that's
All
good.
of
That's
these.
right. Yeah.
This
The
is
Louis
in
Simmons
spite.
strategy.
This
Right.
is in spite of.
Yes. The loud fan. That's
It's
good.
a 80 plus degree day all time deadlift PR,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
right?
And then
Instead
you're
of bitching
always
about it, it's the
winning.
most I've ever done. Always
Yeah.
winning. It spirals in
Totally.
your mind to be
Yeah.
this supreme champion.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, talking about kind of holding all your lifts or peaking all your lifts simultaneously and how almost impossible that is, especially as an advanced lifter. I mean, that's a strategy I've seen you implementing where you kind of hone in on one goal at a
That's
time.
just for my YouTube series, to be
Oh,
honest.
okay.
I hate it.
Okay.
I hate it. I really like, I don't
Really?
like that because people are like, I'm going to do a specialization. You should be working on becoming, well,
Yeah.
continuing to push everything evenly and trying to develop as a well-rounded athlete because it's harder. I'm so like, the more advanced I get, the less I'm impressed by one lift wonders. And the
Mhm.
more I'm impressed by the guy with a really good total who's not the best at anything,
Mhm.
right? Or the guy that brings up, he's a deadlift specialist, but he's got a respectable bench.
Mhm.
You worked even hard, like Kaylor Woolham back in the day, having a good bench. That's more impressive than his deadlift to me because you know he worked like a motherfucker to solve
Yes.
that problem, whereas the deadlift came easy to him. So it's that to me that's more impressive. So I
Yeah.
will always push for people like having like well-rounded development. The 600 bench, I did absolutely like I definitely delved into that like area of specializing.
Yeah.
And the context behind that was it was messing with my overhead training for strongman. So I didn't want to do both at the same time because I felt like I was doing a shitty job at each. So I was like, I'm going to go
Totally.
all in and try to get this done. And that way I'm not benching at all right now. Right. To try to keep my pecs a little bit more mobile, keep my overhead positioning a little bit better, which I think is an overstated issue. I think if you don't bench 600, you're not at such extreme levels of pec development. You can't have a good overhead. Just do a little
Yeah.
bit of mobility work. But I wanted to back off of it. So I was like, I'm going all in. I'm trying to get this
Mhm.
done because I don't want to just drop bench out of my program when I feel like I'm kind of close to that. I
Yeah.
would be
Of
kicking myself.
course.
I know I'm capable of it. I know I
Yeah.
can do it. So I have to do it. Whereas this 880 series, I'm doing myself no favors apparently by not filming my other training, but I am walking the walk here. And
Yeah.
my overhead training is just as rigorous as it normally is. My squat training is slightly biased towards the deadlift, but still very squat strength
Yeah.
oriented. And I'm busting my ass on my event training for this upcoming contest I have in May. So I am actually walking the walk of, yeah, I'll shift a couple of assistance movements to be a little bit extra deadlift bias. And yeah, I'll have my energy drink on my deadlift day because I
Sure.
am making that push for the 880, but I am keeping my, like, I'm practicing what I preach, which is just like,
Yeah.
keep working on overall even development rather than trying to specialize. Is it a viable strategy to specialize? Fuck yes. Especially when you're more advanced. You could do something that would take you 2 years in 8 months if you specialize. But then you're going to be kicking yourself because you probably had a backslide in the other things. So it's like, it is a way to achieve something faster, but it does come at a cost. So you kind of do have to make that like cost benefit analysis.
Well, do you think for you that knocking out the 600-pound bench, kind of like bucket list lift for you, freed you up to fully go into strongman if that wasn't already? Yeah, that's
absolutely
awesome.
Absolutely. I feel like I'm like, okay, now my job is not to be the bench guy. My job is to be good at overhead events, which is not the same thing as having the best strict press, right? Like a lot of guys get caught up in the manly man contest of strict pressing. I don't think getting 4th place, but I barely used my legs, brother, is cooler than winning.
Yeah, because it's not within the parameters of the event.
You split jerk, that requires less shoulder. I won. Shut the fuck up. That's all I can.
Yeah.
Winning is cool to me, right? So it's like, okay, I'm going to try to I'm going on to try to become a proficient overhead athlete. That being said, 600, if I did it, it can't be that hard. So I'm now arrogant. I'm like, at some point I should do 660.
Oh my God.
Like, why not? I'm not even fat yet. Once I'm fat, I can probably do more.
Yeah. Reduce that ROM,
Yeah.
Yeah. Get a bounce off the chest.